It's always fascinating looking through the source materials you send over. And this latest batch really got me thinking some really intriguing stuff about, well, just daily life in ancient times.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Your picks this time really cover a lot. From, what people actually wore day to day to some very different ideas about the body, about
Right,
health.
it's like opening a window onto this world that feels, I don't know, both recognizable in some ways and just totally alien in others.
Exactly. And that's what we want to dig into, right? Explore those differences and see what they tell us about how people lived and thought back then.
Okay, so the first thing that really jumped out at me, and I think it's what a lot of us picture, maybe from movies or TV,
Mm-hmm.
is the clothing. Those
Right.
really iconic wide robes with the huge sleeves.
Mm-hmm.
Did everyone actually dress like that? Because it seems, well, incredibly impractical if you're, say, a farmer out in the fields.
That's a great question, and it hits on a really crucial point. The sources suggest a much more complex picture. Absolutely. In many ancient societies, what you wore wasn't just about staying warm or, basic necessity. It was a huge visual signifier.
The signifier, like of your status.
Exactly. A powerful marker of your place in the social hierarchy. Clothing was like a constant, silent announcement of who you were and where you fit in.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit more. This idea of social hierarchy in clothes. One phrase from the materials really stuck with me. Something about looking up and striving to imitate, but also looking down and preventing perfect imitation.
Yes, that dynamic is key. It paints this picture of a constant visual tug of war, a negotiation of power played out in fabric and
So
style.
it wasn't just fashion, it was politics almost.
In a way, yes. Think about the Zhou dynasty, which was so foundational. The rituals they established, the ones Confucius later championed, weren't just about polite manners. They were deeply tied into reinforcing these visible social distinctions.
That's
Well, the nobility, the elite, they actively cultivated difference, not just through expensive materials, but also through their values, emphasizing things like righteousness, honor, and their behavior, even how they spoke.
So it wasn't enough to just, splash out on fancy robes. You had to act the part too.
Precisely. There was a whole performance involved, and the clothing itself often reflected this deliberate, impracticality.
Impracticality, like the wide sleeves?
Exactly. Those wide robes, the long flowing sleeves, maybe elaborate jade pendants clanking around. Imagine trying to do any kind of physical work dressed like that. You couldn't.
Right, you trip or get snagged on everything.
And that was the point. The impracticality itself was a signal. I am above manual labor. I don't need to work with my hands. It was a visual declaration of their elevated, leisured status.
Ah, okay, that makes perfect sense now. It's kind of like, watching something like Downton Abbey.
Mm-hmm.
You see the aristocracy changing clothes multiple times a day, wearing these stiff, formal outfits, even for breakfast, and you think, wow, that looks uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly. But that very discomfort, that adherence to rigid, sometimes inconvenient customs was part of what set them apart. It reinforced their identity and their social standing.
So even if a farmer suddenly struck it rich, just buying the clothes wouldn't be enough. They wouldn't necessarily know how to wear them, how to carry themselves, how to embody that whole noble air.
That's it, precisely. These things, the expensive, cumbersome clothing, the specific manners, the particular values, they acted as entry thresholds to the upper class. It wasn't just about money.
Right, you needed the cultural capital too.
You needed the cultural capital and you needed to subscribe to their value system. Like valuing honor sometimes even above immediate survival, which was a calculation a commoner often couldn't afford to make.
The source mentioned that saying, didn't it? About being poor in the city versus rich in the mountains.
When one is poor and lives in a busy city, no one knows him. When one is rich and lives in a remote mountain, he has distant relatives.
Yeah, it shows how status creates its own kind of social gravity, its own connections. It's interesting, too, how even belief systems that might preach against material things, like Buddhism, eventually kind of adapted. The idea of needing golden clothes for the Buddha image, maybe for community cohesion.
It really shows how deeply ingrained these social needs for visual distinction and group identity can be. And it's fascinating to contrast that ancient noble ideal where not working was glorious with, say, modern society.
Yeah, today we often hear labor is glorious, right? Our propaganda, our cultural heroes are often depicted as workers in practical clothes getting things done.
Completely the opposite. Think of ancient art, the nobles in their flowing robes. Think of modern socialist realism, the muscular worker in overalls or simple clothes. Polar opposites in terms of what's visually celebrated.
So those wide robes were like an anti-work uniform. And it was a kind of trap for anyone lower down who tried to copy them.
Sort of, yeah. A commoner might scrape together the money for similar clothes, but then they couldn't actually work in them. They couldn't maintain the lifestyle the clothes represented, which just reinforced the noble's position. The clothes themselves police the boundary.
And the word noble itself, you mentioned it, implies being high and expensive.
Right. Both materially expensive and also, you could say, spiritually or ethically expensive. There was an expectation of adhering to costly values, like being willing to sacrifice your life for honor.
Which, as he said, was a much bigger gamble for a commoner.
Absolutely. For a noble, dying for honor might mean their family continues, maybe even gains prestige. For a commoner, their death could mean instant ruin for their family. Survival often meant having to, let's say, swallow humiliation sometimes.
So the values themselves, this code of honor, was another kind of wide robe and large sleeve. Impractical for sheer survival, maybe, but essential for maintaining that social distance.
Beautifully put, yes. It wasn't just the fabric. It was the whole way of being that was designed, consciously or unconsciously, to be difficult to replicate, to maintain that stratified order.
Wow. Okay, that whole system is quite something.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears a bit, because the sources brought up something else, maybe a bit more personal. The question I'd honestly never thought about before.
Yeah.
Did people, like way back before the Warring States period, did they even wear underwear?
Slight pause. Well, based on the available historical hints, the answer seems to be probably not.
Seriously, no underwear.
It seems that way. It's kind of jarring for us, isn't it? It's so fundamental to how we think about clothing now.
Totally jarring. It makes you rethink,
Yeah.
well, everything. Like, Sun Wukong, the Monkey King.
Yeah, from Journey to the West.
Sometimes he's just shown in that tiger skin.
Right.
Maybe that wasn't just artistic license, and maybe it reflected a time when going without, well, underwear
Yeah.
wasn't seen as odd or improper.
It's possible it reflects an older understanding, yeah, where the concept just wasn't the same.
Okay, but that immediately brings up a very practical question, especially thinking about women. How did they manage menstruation without,
That's the logical next question, definitely. And the truth is, for the period before the Han Dynasty, the records are pretty sparse, pretty vague on the specifics of menstrual hygiene. We don't have clear descriptions.
So we just don't know for sure for that earlier time.
Not really, no. But what's fascinating is what happens after the Han Dynasty. Suddenly, we get a lot more information
About what?
about what we'd basically call sanitary pads or cloths. The texts mention things like menstrual cloth or monthly water silk, sometimes just red cloth.
Okay, so they did have ways of managing it later on. That makes sense.
Yes, but here's the really surprising part. The reason we have such detailed records isn't necessarily because people were writing hygiene manuals.
Oh, why then?
It's because, well, used menstrual cloths were apparently a common ingredient in traditional medicine.
Wait, what? In medicine?
Mhm.
Seriously?
Seriously. The sources describe them being used for two main things. One, to cure various illnesses, and two, believe it or not, in making elixirs intended to grant longevity.
Wow. Okay.
Okay.
That's unexpected. I mean, you don't read that in your average history book.
Definitely not. And it wasn't just some, fringe folk remedy. It appears in recognized medical texts of the era, which also implies, of course, that there must have been established ways of collecting them.
Right. Though maybe we don't need the details on that part.
Probably for the best. But it really highlights how differently they viewed the body and its substances.
And it connects to their medical theories, right?
Yeah.
Like yin and yang. You mentioned a quote.
Ah, yes, from the Zhengzong Wake. It described menstrual blood as the true yang within yin, the origin of qi and blood. They saw a powerful life force in it.
So it wasn't seen as unclean necessarily, but as potent.
Exactly, potent enough that the texts suggest even wealthy people, powerful individuals, would consume tonics made with it. It gives traditional medicine a whole new dimension for us.
And it didn't stop there, did it? There was mention of witchcraft, too, using the red cloth.
That's right, another twist. The Taiping Yuan mentions a practice where a husband might burn his wife's used cloth.
Why on earth would he do that?
Apparently, it was believed to ensure she wouldn't be unfaithful or wander off, a kind of magical binding.
Good grief. So it's this incredible mix of the practical, the medicinal, and the magical, all tied up in something very everyday.
It really is. It shows how interconnected their worldview was. What we neatly categorize today, biology here, medicine there, superstition over there for them, it was often all woven together. It's a great reminder that our modern way of seeing things isn't the only way, and certainly wasn't the way of the past.
Absolutely. So just to kind of wrap this up for everyone listening, This deep dive has been pretty eye-opening. We've seen how something as basic as clothing in ancient times was loaded with meaning, a real language of social status, with the elites using impracticality itself as a way to stay separate.
hmm And how their values, their whole way of behaving, even when it seems inconvenient to us, was part of maintaining that social structure, keeping
Yeah.
those lines clear.
Yeah, and then we got into the really personal stuff, realizing daily life could be so different. Like the probable lack of underwear in earlier periods, and these really surprising uses for menstrual cloths and medicine and even magic. It paints a picture of a very different world.
It really does. And maybe that leads to a final thought for you listening out there to chew on.
Oh, yeah.
In our world today, which we often think of as much more egalitarian, do we still see subtle or maybe not so subtle forms of impracticality or high entry thresholds being used? Think about fashion trends that are hard to wear, expensive hobbies, specialized jargon.
Things that signal you're in the know or part of a certain
Right,
group.
exactly. Could those be our modern versions of the noble's wide robes? Ways we signal status or belonging, even without realizing it quite so explicitly. It's certainly something interesting to observe.
That is a great thought to end on. Definitely gives you something to look out for. Well, thank you so much for walking us through all that fascinating and sometimes quite surprising material.
My pleasure. Always interesting stuff to explore.
And thank you all for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one. If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.